And welcome to the third session of the Into the Light webinars. I'm Mike Givler, the communications coordinator for the Synod, and we've had some great conversations so far, thanks in part to the work done by the Presbytery of Redstone's Addiction Ministry Network. So I will open this up with prayer, and then we will go into session 3. Dear Lord, we thank you again for this beautiful day that you've given us. We thank you for this another round of conversations that will enlighten us about the opioid problem that is in our communities and that affects more people than we know and understand to know. We ask that you be with those who are unable to be with us tonight, that you will either be able to heal them or just give them strength as they deal with whatever situation they're dealing with this evening. So be with everyone gathered here tonight and those who will eventually listen to this by recording. We ask that the words that are spoken tonight will hit home for a lot of people and that we'll be able to make a difference in our communities with this addiction that is an epidemic that is in a lot of our areas. This we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. And thank you, Mike. So just, are we going to just remember that we can discuss two different ways. We can actually use a chat. We can send those messages to Sue or to everyone, depending on how you want to do that. Just use the chat function that is at the bottom of your screen, I think on most of yours. And Sue is going to monitor those chats throughout the beginning discussion here. This session is called Healing and Recovery, and we are looking at our churches as being a place where people can experience that. I want you to know that this place tonight, this webinar, is a safe place. We want you to know that if you do speak about someone you know that is in active addiction or past addiction, and we'd like you to feel safe in protecting their anonymity. If you'd like to, just use the words "someone I know." It could be yourself that you're referring to. It could be a husband, a wife, whatever. And secondly, to care for yourself. Know that sometimes the topics that we share are difficult. You may feel that we're speaking directly to you and that we know all about you. Some of the generalities of addiction can have those commonalities. I speak sometimes from my own experience and from what I've learned throughout 20 plus years of working within the field of drug and alcohol prevention. So I'm not sure if somebody shared their screen with me. I again lost my notes. So let me, I do have some physical notes here, but they're easier for me to look at on the screen, and I'm not sure where they disappeared to. So let me check, and I just found them. So I'm learning this webinar stuff too, so please bear with me as we continue. Tonight, we have a goal for this session, and that we want that we can recognize ways that the church has the capacity to offer hope, understanding, and healing to both families and individuals. But there's a challenge that goes with that also, because congregations often fail to understand that God can use them as the agent to bring healing and grace to others. I know that within my own experience, when I've talked to individuals about a person that maybe I'm concerned about, they say, well, we can't do anything, or, you know, that's not my place, or, you know, I don't want to cause any more problems. It's none of my business. We are a place of healing and hope. And the more that we know about this subject of addiction, the more we can understand how we can be a support for that person. It may not be the person with a substance use disorder addiction that we're dealing with directly, but oftentimes it's going to be the family members. It's going to be the coworkers. It's going to be those close friends that are concerned about that person that has that addiction. And when we can be that support for them, not placating them, but helping to give them hope themselves, and to be able to know the resources within our own county that even family members can tap into. That's when we can be that support. And our church itself may be a support, and we'll talk more about those as we go. Much of our background discussion up until now, the first two sessions, were learning about addiction, learning about the actions that we have sometimes, like enabling behaviors that will allow a person to stay within their addiction, not cause them to have the addiction, but keeps them there by protecting them from facing the consequences of their actions. Tonight, we're going to begin to look more at how Christ would want us to respond. We'll be talking more about some of the confusion and fears and struggles that the individual is facing when they realize that they need help and they begin to seek that. So let's talk a little bit about that. Recovery from any illness like cancer or heart disease, diabetes, or substance use disorders, it creates a great deal of confusion, fear. It creates struggle, and it creates pain, both mental and physical. In the early stages of recovery, the person that is in treatment maybe, or even deciding to go into treatment, they may perceive that road that's ahead of them as too dangerous or too difficult to travel. Initially, they may be too frightened to begin that journey even. They feel overwhelmed by the decisions that need to be made in order to travel into this unknown territory. Those who have decided to begin the journey need the support of others to discover the courage to open themselves up to the opportunities that treatment and recovery can bring. So a difficult journey requires a lot of trust in God. The person that's beginning that journey may not have a relationship with God, but having a friend or a community for support and not taking that journey alone, that enriches their life. It may open their eyes, particularly to the support that God's congregation and community can give them. Those suffering from long-term illnesses like a substance use disorder, they need to understand that they're more than their disease. They are children of God, and that God, in His infinite love for us, will help us through that. People in recovery are seeking a place where they can belong, a place where they're accepted. We talked in previous sessions about the stigma that oftentimes is attached to individuals with a substance use disorder. They carry that stigma themselves also. They believe that, you know, people are judging them or talking about them or whispering behind their backs. In early recovery, they might not know that they need a place, that they need a place which is safe for them. And that's why trustworthy companions and friends and support systems are so important. Now, Lee McDermott couldn't be with us tonight. We all know Lee is one that has been very instrumental in this curriculum. And he has often extended, he's a pastor, and he's often extended invitations to recovery people to join him in Sunday morning worship. what he tells us is that their responses are frequently something like this. Well, I'll go back to church after I get my act together. And maybe you've even heard that from people that aren't experienced substance use disorders. They maybe don't feel they're worthy. But Lee's response to them is, God is ready for you now. I'd hope that this church could be a place where you could get your act together. On the other hand, Lee also says that sadly, many of those recovering people believe that the church is unwilling to accept them until they are getting it together, until they are perfect people and not flawed ones. And we all know that we're all flawed, and none of us are perfect but Christ. But yet, those in substance use disorder and having addictions, they don't think that. They think they've got to at least begin the journey before they can step into a church. Jesus does not call us to go and find disciples who are already disciples. He says, go and make disciples. Lee's taken some liberties, and he's paraphrased what Paul says in Romans 5:8. He says, God proves he loves us first while we still don't have our act together. So in Matthew, we have some scripture that is interesting, and maybe Sue will follow up with this in a little bit, but let me read you what Lee has said about this. First of all, from Matthew 9:9, it says, as Jesus was walking along, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at his tax collector booth. Follow me and be my disciple, Jesus said to him. So Matthew got up and followed him. Now, Jesus knew that it was a religious violation to break bread with tax collectors, with social outcasts, and with misfits, not to mention to be in close contact with a diseased woman. Still, he broke bread with them, broke bread with all of them. They gathered around a common table, and they clearly were a group gathered in fellowship. Jesus is literally a friend of sinners. He did these things because he believed that showed mercy, that it showed that mercy is never against the law of God. By sitting down with misfits and outcasts, Jesus earns the disdain of the purity-conscious Pharisees. Jesus turns the tables, telling them that he has come to call not the righteous, but sinners. He says, go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And those scriptures are from Matthew 9, verses 12 and 13. And I've used the New Revised Standard Version in those quotations. Now, Sue's with us tonight, Reverend Sue Washburn. She's pastor of a small church called Reunion Presbyterian, and she's a member of our Addiction Ministry Network. Sue, could you share with us one of your stories that kind of illustrates this?
Sure. There was one time I was standing at the door greeting people who would come to worship, and we're right there in view of the parking lot, and somebody was walking in with like bushy hair and a big beard, and one of the deacons said, "Oh my, who's that?" And I turned to her and I said, "Oh, well, that's my cousin." And she was aghast. But he did not fit the stereotype for the people who worship at that church. It is, in some ways, it's not a high liturgy. People don't wear suits, but people do tend to dress up. There's not a lot of big bushy facial hair. And it was disappointing to me that one of the church leaders would actually have that response. So that was that was an eye-opening experience.
Mhm.
Because this is the same person who, if there is a visitor who fits the culture and profile of the church, will literally sit next to them and guide them through the service. So,
Thanks, Sue. I think we've probably all experienced some of those things within our churches.
mhm.
And I think what we need to remember is that, as we've said before, people with substance use disorders are more than their disease. They are children of God also. We all are. And, you know, God does not look at us and say, oh, well, you've got a little sin, you're not so bad, and you've got a bigger sin, you know, you know, we're going to judge you a little bit heavier. We do that, but God looks at everybody the same, and he loves us all, no matter what sin and what thorn in our side we may have. And calling Matthew to be one of his disciples, you know, Jesus picked one of the most unlikely individuals. He was a tax collector who by profession was despised by even his own people, you know. But Jesus had that ability to look past that long beard and outward appearance and into his heart, seeing that not only what we are, but also what we could be. And those are the eyes that we need to look at to anybody that walks into our church. But in speaking about the issues of opioid crisis and just addiction in general, you know, our curriculum was written as our response to addiction. The opioids certainly right now have gained huge attention, and that's the thing that we gravitate to. What can we do about the opioids? It's addiction, whether it's caused by alcohol, whether it's caused by methamphetamine or cocaine or any substance that has a grip on the individual's mind, spirit, soul. Those are the things that God does not judge, and he sees all of us as individuals that he loves and cares for, and that's what he wants us to do also. So what did Matthew see in Jesus that made him instantly ready to leave everything to follow Jesus? What do you think? What was it that Jesus saw in Matthew? Any thoughts?
I think it'd be a little easier to think about what Matthew would see in Jesus. And I think that people sense when we honor and see their dignity, even though they might be having trouble. And I think if people sense that, then they are drawn to people who honor who they are, not necessarily those who are, like you said, somebody who has addiction is more than the sum of their disease, more than just their disease. The person that they respond to might see the other parts of them, and that's, we all want to be seen and we all want to be known, and I think that's probably part of what happened with Matthew.
Mm-hmm. Now, we did this activity in another session, but I think I'm going to ask this here. I'd like you all to think about somebody that you know that is either active in addiction now or has been affected by it. And I'd like you to think of them not in terms of their addiction, but in terms of who are they besides their addiction? Who are they to you? Who are they to somebody else? Are they a son or a daughter, a doctor? Just say some words out loud, any of you, just of a person that you're thinking of, not looking at their addiction. Who are they?
Friend.
Nephew.
Grandmother.
Friend.
Friend.
Coworker. Jesus saw them for who they were as a child of God. He did not see Matthew as the tax collector, the one that was the scorn of even his friends. At that moment, maybe Matthew saw in Jesus the hope of true friendship and peace with God. Maybe he experienced the irresistible grace of God. When we look at individuals beyond their disease or beyond the issues that they have, we are allowing them to see God in us. Early church theologian, Augustine stated, "Our hands and hearts are full of those things which prevents us from filling them with God's grace." Their hands are not just full of their drugs of choice, but they may be filled with hopelessness, despair, pain, and confusion. Those impacted by a substance use disorder need our help to let go of their grip upon those things which hold them captive. Our task is to help set them free and open their hands and hearts to accepting God's grace. The role of the church is both relational and spiritual, offering hope, understanding, and healing to families and individuals affected by alcohol and other drugs. The dilemma that people with a substance use disorder face is that they don't want to empty their hands of their drugs of choice because they're afraid that there will not be anything left to fill their hands or their lives. They're often fearful about the unknown because they just don't know what it will be like to not have those drugs. For so long, that substance has been their priority, their life, their everyday waking and thought. And they might be afraid to know what else might be out there, or they may be afraid that there is no hope for them. They've arrived at the point where, well, they're clinging to some hope, love, grace, or some other good thing that maybe are beyond their reach. We often link grace to joy and gladness, but grace does not always come yoked to good times or happy circumstances. As well as being amazing grace, it can also come as suffering grace, difficult grace, painful grace, costly grace, or illogical grace. Despite its various forms, grace is always enough grace. The popular song that's a contemporary song, "My Grace is Enough," comes to mind when I think of those words. As Paul discovered about his own life and struggles to rid himself of his thorn in his side, he said each time he said, "My grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness. So now I'm glad to boast about my weakness so that the power of Christ can work through me." That's 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9. Stories of recovery and hope can be quite inspiring, but sadly, many individuals deal with daily struggles and pains during their initial recovery. Regrettably, some lose their battle with substance use disorders. We need to tell the story of grief and struggle as well as the stories of success. And I think sometimes we need to be open and honest with individuals that when they go into treatment maybe a first time, our belief is, oh, thank goodness they're fixed. And sometimes that's just the beginning. Sometimes the bigger struggle occurs even after they start treatment. One thing that I learned during my years of prevention is that the average, when a person does go into treatment, the average number of stays is 7. That means that there are people that may be in treatment 14 times before they finally are able to stay in recovery. And sadly, there are individuals that will go and maybe go a number of times and never be able to release themselves from that bondage. But with us as a church and with us providing support, we believe and we know that recovery and healthy lifestyles are achievable at a much greater rate than if we throw up our hands and say, well, I can't do anything until they hit rock bottom. God's grace is enough, and He can lead us and help us to know how we can help those. So, Sue, I'm going to, I think, stop right here. And I'm going to ask if there's any questions or comments that anybody wants to make right at this point before I turn this over to Sue for a look at what the Word says.
Okay. I did have some questions that came in on the chat that I think are going to go nicely with the discussion that I have planned. One of the things that struck me when I was looking at the curriculum and that Lee had written was the discussion about grace, and he talked about the different kinds of grace. And I hadn't really spent time thinking that there was amazing grace and suffering grace and painful grace and costly grace and illogical grace. And I just wondered if, has anybody ever experienced these other kinds of grace? With my own cancer journey, there have been some, I have experienced grace in new ways. Some of them not always are good because the circumstances weren't good. But has anybody ever, and has anybody experienced any of these other kinds of grace in a way that you're willing to talk about and share with the group? And the other question for folks is, are these other things grace? Does grace always need to feel good?
Sue, I know an individual that I've worked with very closely, a person in recovery for 20 years. I've had the blessing of meeting her and learning about her, and she's become a very, very good friend. She has struggled throughout her life with addiction. I mean, she had abuse in her upbringing, both sexual and emotional and physical. So, I mean, from the time she was 8, she had a stepfather that gave her drugs to allow his ability to abuse her. And yet, she has such a strong faith, and she has had continuing issues that have been probably a direct result of her drug usage over the years. Things that now are developing into medical issues that have caused physical disability, and have caused her to have just increasingly difficult times with her life financially and otherwise. Yet you can see the grace of God has just wrapped his arms around her to provide her with opportunities for joy, knowing that he has given her a peace that I don't see in most people. And yet it has come more with the pains and the consequences of her usage. And I would say that's a suffering and a painful and a costly grace. But it is a peace that she has, that she knows that she is forgiven by her God. And although she continues to pay those consequences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, thank you. Anybody else before we move on? Okay.
Sue, can I ask a question about the workbook?
Yes.
On page 37, and it was said in the lecture, I'm looking down at the next to last bullet point, next to last paragraph. The quote, if it could be explained a little more, people with SUD face the dilemma of emptying their hands because they're afraid there won't be anything left there. That hasn't been my impression. That's why people go to use disorders or find themselves moving there. I've always thought it's because they're experimenting and it becomes something addictive in terms of enjoyment or usage or alternative or getting lost. So can you fill that out a little bit more for me, or can someone fill that out? I'm being a classic old white-haired guy here.
Well, I think, and we were with earlier in the discussion talking a little bit about some of the overlap with substance use disorder and mental health disorders. And I think sometimes substance use disorder ends up as a way of self-medicating.
Okay.
I feel empty. I feel alone. My own experience with the girl that I had taught Sunday school to, why are you using heroin? And she said, because it makes me feel loved. Some of it, I think, does begin with experimentation. Some of it begins maybe always first through experimentation, but it continues to fill a need. And then especially with opioids, part of the challenge is once people are addicted, stopping the use of opioids while it is not a health problem. Like if you are detoxing from alcohol, there are health consequences. You can detox from opioids without having health consequences, but you're literally physically sick. They call it being dope sick. So after a time, it's not always just the high that people are pursuing, it's the avoidance of being dope sick that forces them to go to get the next hit. But I think there is a high level of self-medication that is involved with addiction.
Okay.
And I'll see if Linda has anything to add to that as somebody who's worked in the field.
Yeah, the physiological effects of alcohol or other drugs, oftentimes people don't recognize that particularly with alcohol, their use is becoming a dependence. They don't see the issues and the problems. They drink and get intoxicated because it makes them feel good. Any drug works on the part of the brain that we call the pleasure center, and it makes us feel good. It's like the feeling that we get when we eat a good meal, or we score a touchdown, or we get our natural highs those ways. But drugs work on that same part of the brain. And what happens as a person continues to use is that instead of it making, they'll use and then they'll not use and feel about the same. But as their use continues, they need to use to feel better. And after a while in the addiction, they have to use just to feel normal, because when they're not using, they're in a depression or they feel bad physically or whatever. And so it develops and becomes more of a spiral downhill that is both physical, emotional, psychological. It ties all those things. It's spiritual. We forget about oftentimes the spiritual end of it, but people break their own rules because, you'll hear people say, well, I'll go to the party tonight. I'll only have a couple, and they get smashed. They break their own rules that they've set for themselves. Or, I'll never shoot up. And then they've started popping pills, and that doesn't fill the void, and they're looking for a better high. And so they go to the injection, which gives them a more immediate need. So when we say it fills their hands, it does. It becomes their seeking. It becomes what they have to have in order to feel any sense of normalcy at all.
I was going to say too, so many of us are like that with our phones.
Mm-hmm.
We literally need to have our phones in our hands in order to feel like we're going to be competent for our day. And I think we're all, a phone addiction is one that most of us can understand, and we can justify it in a lot of different ways. But that's something that many of us feel like we have to have in our hands in order to be who we are. It fulfills some of our identity in some ways. I'd like to pivot a little bit to talk about some of the passages that we have looked at and that you had alluded to, Linda. One was the passage from Matthew, and it was about the calling of Matthew, and I'm going to put this up on the screen. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, there were the tax collectors and sinners there. Why does your teacher eat with those kinds of people? And Jesus says, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. So go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. I've not come to call the righteous, but the sinners. And I think that this is a good starting place for us to talk about expectations and the challenges some of our churches face. And Ken, this is going to tie into your question of how do people who are suffering from substance use disorders, how do they know that we will not accept them? I think some of it is the cultural similarity or the ways our churches are culturally homogenetic in our education, our income, our life experiences. When my cousin came to the church with his big bushy beard and work pants, and he may have even had a hat on, he didn't fit the culture of that church, but he's the leader, a church leader, and on this board of the church that he goes to way out in Somerset County. So he fit the culture of his church. He did not fit the culture of the church where I was. So I think our people who don't feel like they fit culturally is one of the challenges that we face, and we need to think about how do we change that. There's a lot of silence and shame around substance use disorders. And next week, we're going to talk a little bit about what churches can do even starting this week. And one of them is to begin to talk about addiction and substance use disorder from the pulpit, whether it's through sermons or in the prayers of the people, but just mentioning substance use disorder or addiction or opioids can sometimes allow people to feel like they can come forward and talk to the leadership about what's going on in their lives. One of the things that Lee McDermott, who you hear us invoking Lee a lot, he is such a wonderful leader. But he says the stories of recovery are stories of the gospel. And for us not to be using stories of recovery or the language of recovery is really to miss a huge and prevalent way of explaining the gospel to people. And probably many more than a lot of us suspect. And I think sometimes in a church where we have an unwillingness to be vulnerable, we think that we have to have our act together before we can come and be part of that community. And I think that we've all heard people say that from, whatever position that they are in. But that's really not what Jesus is saying in that passage from Matthew. So those are some of the challenges that churches face. And I was wondering if anybody had anything that they would maybe add to that. Anything our churches are doing to make people or families feel unwelcome.
I think sometimes the fact that after church, I know within our church, it's very common for you to flock to your friends and to chit chat with them, and you've got your own little clique, and sometimes the person that's that new person that comes in, they're the ones we need to flock to. They're the ones we need to go and greet and make them feel warm and welcome. I sit in the back of our church, and I run the sound system back there, but normally I would like to sit up front. But it's kind of advantageous, too, to sit in the back. You see the latecomers that come in. Sometimes you see a new person that comes in. They don't, our ushers have sat down. They need a bulletin. They might not know where to sit. To welcome them to come in and to sit beside me and to show them, for some people that might walk into a church, our format of doing things is foreign to them. And
right.
Particularly if it's a person that's never been in that type of church. So making them feel welcome, I think, and making them feel noticed is so important, no matter who they are.
Yeah, I think we're getting to the point where even a bulletin is kind of foreign. Our church seems to be modeled on old European concerts or theater events, and now the most common is the concert. You don't need a bulletin. You just walk in. Everything you need to know is going to be up front for you. So yeah. So culture is a big part of that. And intentionality. Ken, you look like you're going to speak.
Oh, I'm glad you can see me because I can't see me. I think that's fair and it's accurate, but how in the world do people know that's how we're behaving if they don't come in? How do we counteract that when we're already doing it and we're there? So how do you communicate other than by publicity? And I'm thinking word of mouth. I'm thinking I participate in 2 addiction boards here in the county and let them know what we're trying to do. And I see this, it frustrates me, another conversation. The county screws up right and left, and they just tick the hell out of me with what they're doing. But it's not, I don't know how you can, I don't know how we can expect. I'm looking for suggestions. This is what my church is, and this is what we do. How do you know this is what I'm doing? Unless it's word of mouth, presentation, advertisement. I don't know. I don't know how I get beyond that. Other than if they don't even come into the parking lot, I don't know what to say.
Yeah.
I can't. You can't. I don't think it's unfair. I understand what you're saying. I understand what everybody's saying. Yeah, we come off that way by our history and by our tradition. But good grief, give us a chance. But we don't. How do you convince the abuser, disorder, give us a chance? I get that. So I want to know. I want to hear. How do we get past that? How do we offer things? Do we advertise? Do we blitz? Do we connect? Which is everything I'm trying to do.
Yeah, and I think you kind of hit it on the head with connect, because
Okay.
If you can establish the relationship outside the church,
Mm-hmm.
and then issue the personal invitation, that's
McDermott.
probably
Okay.
your best bet. But the question becomes, and certainly as a pastor, where can you get away with spending your time? If you need to spend, X number of hours in the office, could you go to the AA meeting? Is that going to count against? Because some of the AA and NA meetings are open. Although one of the churches that I was involved with, there was a whole bunch of people. It was one of my first days, and came in, and I said, "Oh, what are you guys all here for?" Because I had no idea. I thought maybe there was a church event, and they're like, "Oh, we're here for AA." I'm like, "Oh, is it an open meeting?" And they all looked at each other, and I said, "I'm the pastor," and they, I said, "Is it an open meeting?" And they looked at each other like, "We don't want her," but they were meeting in the church. So I think I think that establishing personal relationships is the first thing. I think the second thing is allowing people to belong before they believe. So often we as churches want people to believe before they can belong. And we need to welcome people with their unformed theology, with their brokenness, with their hard questions, and maybe even with their lack of faith, trusting that the Holy Spirit is going to work and guide them. But I think that sense of creating that sense of belonging is important. And I think you're right. It has to start outside the church. I don't think any advertising, I don't think any third person communication is going to make that work. I think it's got to be one-on-one.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Elaine.
What we've found over time is that a lot of the current members are recovering addicts or alcoholics.
Wow.
And we didn't know that, but over time, it was like a sense. So we stopped serving wine and started serving grape juice because we became sensitive to the fact that there were people among us who were silent about their addiction. And it seems maybe because of the neighborhood in which we're in, a lot of the members have a past of abuse of alcohol and drugs. So we kind of see ourselves as a hospital, recovering hospital.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you're trying to live out the hospital metaphor that's in the Matthew passage. And I know that we had a special worship service about addiction where we had a person who was in recovery from the church tell his story. And we had another woman whose daughter, unfortunately, died from addiction and mental health problems tell her story. So I think testimony is powerful and can be used once, if you used for the people who are there to take away some of the shame and the stigma, especially if they're well respected. I mean, the guy who talked about his recovery from alcohol was very well respected, and he'd been in recovery a lot of years. So, we had one story that was not very hopeful at all, and another story that was full of hope. Any other thoughts?
This is Linda. I think we need to go outside of the walls of our church, definitely. To the places that we are in our outside of our church life, to engage in conversations with individuals, to keep our radar up for opportunities to invite And you know, Pastor Pete Getches is our pastor at Poke Run. He does CrossFit, you know, and he's engaged people in conversation there. And we just need to open ourselves up and be knowledgeable enough to and willing enough to talk about the subjects, to talk about it in love and not disdain, to show our acceptance. Silence keeps people in addiction, and it keeps people in the dark. It's like they make the alliteration that it's like being in the room with the elephant. No one talks about the elephant being there, and yet you got to walk around it and whatever, but you never speak about it. We can't let that happen in our churches, and we need to make people feel safe that if they are willing to open and expose themselves to share a story about maybe the place of addiction in their own life or within their own family, because 1 out of every 4 families has it in their family. We need to be willing to listen and be non-judgmental. And I think that's where we need to start within our own congregation. But we need to take it outside the walls.
And I think we need to be realistic. Linda, you might remember this because this happened at Poke Run. I had the brilliant idea of busing kids in from the low-income housing.
Oh, yes, I remember.
And that was a real challenge there was a real cultural difference. And I always summarize it by saying the kids from the low-income housing who probably had parents suffering from addiction learned the song Jesus Loves Me, and all the little kids at the church learned how to give the finger. Everybody learned something.
Yes.
So we need to be realistic too about when we're mixing these different cultures, there's going to be, I mean, if we're successful in doing it, there's going to be conflict. And it can be a challenge.
But jeez.
Let's see, what time do we have?
We
have about 5 minutes. I just want to take a little bit of time to talk about the 2 Corinthians passage. In this, Paul had just shared his experience of being in the third heaven, a spiritual experience that he had about a decade ago. But he's not boasting about having this special spiritual experience, because he has also has what he refers to as a thorn in the flesh, a thorn that reminds him that he is mortal and not of heaven, a thorn that reminds him of his weakness. And we all have had thorns, and addiction can be a kind of thorn as well. And I'm thinking about it symbolically in terms of Paul's thorn is lifelong, much like addiction is a lifelong life event. It can't be cured, and staying in recovery is a lifelong challenge. And I think that Paul is direct. One of the things that I think is good about this passage is Paul is directly saying, I didn't want this. I have had to deal with this. And he's admitting that he has it. And of course, we don't know exactly what that thorn is. But the question is, can we be churches who talk about our thorns? And can we create a culture where it's okay to say, I have this, I wish I didn't, but this is part of who I am, and God's grace is still with me. So I think that the 2 Corinthians can offer us some, just kind of a little bit of a different window into how addiction can be addressed. We can talk about it. We can recognize that God can still work through even that weakness. I think it's important for us to recognize that. And that's that. We're just about out of time, so I guess the last thing I would like to do is kind of throw it to you all to see if you have any questions. Do you have any thoughts that this has spurred for you? Any suggestions about how we can offer hope?
I think we can offer hope by believing that there is hope and trying to show that to others through our compassion and love.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think that as we're all different people, there are all kind of different churches, and different churches will be more accepting than others. Some will be, you might say, old-fashioned. Some will be on the tip of the iceberg with this. And so it's not an easy thing for every church to do, but there need to be people in the church that are willing to step forward and sort of lead. And I think it's, if you wait for them to come to church, you're not going to get them. I think you have to go outside, associate with people, and invite them to come with you so that they feel comfortable when they come.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Dan.
You know, this is Linda. I've had the opportunity to lead this 7-session program at our church, and we have had, I have had 3 that have come to every session. And one of the comments that I've received from them is how much they've learned about the disease of addiction, and just that understanding that it's not a choice that a person is making to be a user, that it's not a willpower thing that they can just quit. Learning that and learning some of the things about enabling have really changed their attitude about the substance use disorder individual. And so having my background in prevention, I always say education is so important.
Mm-hmm.
Willing to provide that information to those in our church, and then they become the disciples to share with the individuals that they've learned. And I think this is where attitudes begin to change, and that's when churches become more accepting and understanding of both families and individuals that are suffering from the diseases.
Mm-hmm. The people become the apostles, the sent ones who don't just stay in the church but go out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. What I'd like to do, I'm going to share the screen here in a minute with the Serenity Prayer to close. And if you could unmute your mics, we'll say that all together. And then as we finish up, we do have some help phone numbers for you. Those will be the closing screen. I think everybody here is from Pennsylvania, so we really don't need all of them, but those will be that'll be the closing screen. So just give me a minute here. I'm going to share we'll do the Serenity Prayer together. All righty. Let us pray. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot
change.
Courage to change
things I can.
and wisdom
To know the difference.
Amen. And there's the numbers for help if you should need it. And I look forward to seeing everybody next week.
And I would just share on that, Sue, that top number, the national number, is truly a national number that can be used by anybody, even those in Florida that might still be on the line.
Okay. Yeah, very good. All right, all take care. God bless you. Thank you. And I look forward to talking with you next week.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you, everybody.
So if you want to stop the recording,
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to do that.
yeah, like where it
I
says
think I have to
record.
stop sharing the screen to do that.
Yeah.
I thought I could do it from there.